witness was introduced as an expert in trace evidence and fiber analysis. She has testified as to her education, training, experience, and methods that she used to test and render opinions in this case. She's now undergoing cross-examination, and the defense has offered evidence as to from which the jury could infer some importance regarding the existence of fiber on the defendant's uniform. It's typical for experts to conduct controlled tests to determine in assisting in forming their opinion. This is appropriate cross-examination, and I admit the exhibits over objection, with the portion being redacted that the solicitor stated he will redact. We can have the witness back. Where did she go? Oh, back there. Bring the jury, please. Thank you. The exhibit is admitted, and you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Fletcher, I was asking you about the experiments to the sample or exemplar shirt. If you could just explain briefly again for the jury what you did to that exemplar shirt.
I took that test shirt and I placed it under my microscope so that I could observe any damage that was present that was caused by the taser during a controlled experiment.
And you used various lengths of tasing on that shirt?
Different time intervals, yes, sir.
Okay. And was that to So you could get a broad perspective of different types of damage that might be caused?
Yes, sir, we went from 1 second up to 30 seconds.
And I believe you were testifying about that drive stun taser would cause holes. Could you describe those to the jury?
The microscopic holes that were created in our experiment were composed of melted fibers that came together to form a void in the fabric. These holes are extremely small. Some of them are just a little larger than the actual voids in the fabric weave itself, but they do have a characteristic of having been melted together to create that hole.
Showing you a portion of what's been entered, states 54,
Okay.
6254. You recognize this photograph?
I would need a little more information.
Sure. Let me show you the entire.
Okay.
Ms. Fletcher, what are we seeing on the screen behind you there?
May I stand up?
Sure.
There's a void in the fabric right here, and that's created by the inward melting of the fibers around it. And that is similar to what we saw in every instance except one of the drive stun experiment.
Okay. And which picture is that?
That was the 5-second stun with no cartridge in place.
Okay. So when you did a 5-second drive stun to a shirt, exactly like the shirt Officer Slager was wearing that day, you found these types of holes.
Yes, sir.
Did you find that type of hole on Officer Slager's shirt?
No, I did not.
When you did a 4-second drive stun to a shirt, exactly like the one Officer Slager was wearing that day, did you find holes like that?
I found similar holes. They were, again, voids in the fabric created by melting of fibers.
On the shirt Officer Slager actually had on the day of question, did you find any?
No, sir.
When you did a 3-second drive stun, did we have similar holes?
Yes, sir.
Any on Officer Slager's shirt?
No, sir.
When we had a 2-second drive stun, did you have holes?
The holes were considerably smaller at 2 seconds, but they were still present and created by the melting of fibers.
Any on Officer Slager's shirt?
No, sir.
And the 1-second drive stun?
Very small holes, barely larger than the actual voids in the fabric weave. It was still present with the melting of fibers. Excuse me, but it should be noted that I only examined the left pocket of Officer Slager's shirt to look for those holes.
Okay. And that was the area that we're talking about, right?
Yes, sir.
So let's, if I could, you recognize this exhibit marked and entered as states 50, sled item 34?
Can I put on a pair of gloves?
Sure. Probably should get.
Yes, sir. I recognize this as item 34 and sled lab number L15-04608, and I can identify that based upon my initials and the date in which I examined that.
So the area that you found these belted fibers, what area is that?
It's this pocket right here.
Would that be the sort of similar to my pocket here?
Yes, sir.
I realize this may not be expertise, but would you agree that's a pretty visible area of a person's shirt? I can see that pretty clearly
Yes, sir.
on the shirt I'm wearing.
Yes, sir.
And that, if you, to as close as you can get it, where did you find these picked fibers?
The pick fiber is approximately right there, and there were melted fibers in this area as well as along the seam right here.
And those are the fibers that you've shown photographs to the jury in Mr. Savage's testimony.
Yes, sir.
And you look right here where those fibers are under the microscope.
I looked in this whole area of this shirt for,
And where did you find the holes that the taser causes?
I did not find any microscopic holes that were caused by melting of fibers.
Okay. At some point, were you able to look at a report by someone else that said that they thought they had found consistent holes?
I have seen other reports in this case.
I withdraw the question, Your Honor. I'll move on.
Question?
Ms. Fletcher, you analyzed all that area that you just indicated to the jury.
Yes, sir.
Did you find any microscopic holes consistent with what you found in your taser experiment here?
No, sir.
And you again, if you could, you have a master's degree in forensics.
I do.
You are proficient in the use of these sort of microscopes that you're using here.
Yes, sir.
You have how many years at SLED?
Just over 9.
A qualified fiber examiner,
Yes, sir.
and you found no holes.
Not on the left side of that left pocket, no.
Okay. Not in the area of the melted fibers?
No, sir.
So let's move on to the melted fibers. Let's first address sort of implication or accusation. We discussed earlier, the testing that you guys do comes from information you get from investigators. Is that correct?
The requests that we receive come from investigators.
And it's determined what needs to be done, and that's based on investigation. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So if the stories change, the testing might change. Is that correct?
That is a possibility.
So if new facts are alleged and new facts come up, even at the last minute, you guys don't just sit on your hands, right? You move to do what needs to be done, right?
If we're requested to do so, yes, sir.
Okay. And do that in a way that gets the information to both the state and the defense. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Even at the 11th hour.
Yes, sir, as long as they are according to our processes and operations.
Especially in the situation, hypothetical situation, where the story changes in the 11th hour. Is that true?
I object to this line of question. The inference he's given is obvious and it's absolutely false. We object to this type of questioning. This is a slavery.
All right, speaking response to a speaking objection.
I think it is. I think she was impeached on the fact that this was done a couple of weeks before the trial began, and I'm explaining that sometimes things come up at that time that requires different testing to be
All
done.
right, I sustain the objection.
So your observations of these fibers were consistent with, at some point, the fibers coming into contact with a heat source.
Correct, sir. That exceeded the temperature, the melting point of polyester.
Okay. You've been qualified as an expert and you're a scientist, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So let me ask a very important question. Is your testimony to this jury, to a scientific degree of reliability, that that area of the shirt was tased?
My opinion is that I cannot rule out a taser that caused that damage. I can't say that it definitively did. I can't say it definitively did not.
Okay. So you observed damage, but all you can say is that was from some kind of heat.
Some sort of high heat greater than the temperature or at the melting point of polyester.
Could that heat have come into contact with that shirt years ago?
Yes, sir. I can't tell the time in which that damage occurred.
Okay. However, months before?
There's no, I can't put a timetable on that.
Okay, so you certainly aren't testifying to this jury that that damage on the shirt came from April 4th?
No, sir.
Or came from a taser with any sort of scientific reliability?
No, sir.
Okay. And when you looked microscopically at the area of those melted fibers, you found none of the holes that the taser caused in your experiment?
No, sir.
In fact, I believe I asked you sort of the state of the science and looking at something and saying, looking at a melted fiber and saying a taser caused that. Do you recall how you responded to that question?
I don't believe that the state of forensic science as it stands, or that we are capable of identifying a mark or a damage to fabric as definitively having come from a taser at this point.
Okay, so it's your belief as a scientist that if anyone were to attempt to do so, that would be scientifically invalid?
According to the lack of published research, yes, sir.
Did you note any other sort of damage to this area of the shirt?
Under
Markings, I should say.
the only other markings besides the damaged fibers that I observed, there was the area of light brown material that was physically consistent with soil or sand.
Okay. And are we talking about microscopic amounts of soil and sand? Very small amounts of it?
It's fairly visible on the shirt. You can only identify individual particles under a microscope, but that area right there.
Okay, so this amount of sand and soil, when you talk about that, you're not talking about dirt in the pocket?
No, sir, I never opened the pocket to perform an analysis.
Are you talking about this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is the sand and the soil that we've been hearing about?
That's the only sand or soil I observed.
Ms. Fletcher, the heat that could be caused by a taser or any other sorts of heat if it got hot enough, right?
Yes, sir.
It's said to have come from an arcing of electricity between these 2 points?
I'm not a taser expert, so I wouldn't be able to say definitively that.
Okay, but it is said to have possibly come from the end of a taser?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But none of these marks were caused, right?
I'm sorry?
None of these marks were caused on the shirt that we've talked about, the holes.
There were no holes on item 34, no.
So we're talking about, and I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, there's definitely no battery.
No, you're fine.
You're talking about the potential, that we can't say it, that the melting was caused by a taser this far away. Or-
I wouldn't
or
be-
some distance away.
All of our experiments at the laboratory were done where there was contact made, so I would not be able to infer anything from a distance away.
So you wouldn't infer that melting could be caused from this far away,
Not without doing an experiment, no, sir.
or this far away,
No, sir.
or if I've got this 15 to 17 feet away with my back turned, would you expect to find melting on your shirt?
Without doing any experiments, I don't have an opinion on that.
Thank you for being here. Please answer any questions that you just asked.
Yes, sir.
The testing on this was started when?
The experiment,
Yes.
February 19th.
And that was a continuous experiment that was completed in October of 2016, and the report was written on October 20. Is that correct?
The experiment was a continuous process between February and October. A report was generated based upon the item of evidence analyzed on October 20th.
And your report indicates holes or no holes, that there's no explanation that you can think of for the damage on Officer Slager's shirt other than it being tased.
The report states basically that I can't rule out a taser, and the reason that it states that is because the question that was being asked of me, is there possible damage from a drive stun event caused by a taser? So in order to answer that question, I articulated it in my report.
Now, in your testing, you didn't just test for a report that was given about this specific case. In other words, when you do a scientific evaluation, you do it under various conditions, correct?
Yes, sir.
And for instance, are you familiar with whether or not Officer Slager had a conductive undergarment on?
To my direct knowledge, I do not know what he was wearing underneath his uniform shirt.
And if it was a protective vest, the conductivity of that particular vest would make a difference on the damage to the shirt. Is that correct?
A conductive vest is a protective vest would be non-conductive. We did not use a vest underneath it, but we did use a non-conductive surface.
And you used a metal frying pan?
I believe you're referring to the first test that we did for the 5-second tase. It was on a metal plate.
Yeah, so the point of it is, as scientists, you try a whole lot of different things, correct?
We try to, yes, sir.
And the reason why you would do a whole lot of different things is because this is electricity, and electricity follows its own mind. It goes in different directions. It can go direct. It goes to the most attractive method of getting to where it's going.
That would be beyond my scope.
Well, we know when we use copper wires, because that takes electricity to
Correct.
a specific direction, correct?
I mean, it's going to go towards a more conductive surface.
And a shirt, if it has sweat, has different conductive properties than a dry shirt.
That would be beyond my scope.
Now, the issue on yellow paint, the analysis of yellow paint is chemical, correct?
A combination of chemical and microscopic, yes, sir.
So that there are all kinds of yellow paint, since like at the AutoZone, there could be a parking lot with yellow lines.
Yes, sir.
It could be compared to that, or at the Harris Teeter, or at the Piggly Wiggly, if that was still around. Different yellow markings could be the source of the paint.
Different yellow paints can have different chemistries.
And to show that it was at the Yellow Brick Road, that can be chemically compared to the markings on the cell phone and on the taser.
It is possible to do that analysis, yes.
And on the GSR, is there any scientific way of distinguishing one of the three sources of the GSR? Is there any way that you or anyone else could tell the jury that it was as a result of firing a weapon, the result of being near a weapon that was fired, or being there because of a secondary transfer?
In some instances, based on the evidence, you can give a better likelihood to one scenario over the other, but I'm not aware of any research where you can definitively say one over the other.
And the distance in which GSR travels is dependent on the ammunition.
And the type of weapon, yes, sir.
Right. So when somebody would offer that it was 59 feet or yards, whatever, meters, it all depends on the ammunition. It all depends on the weapon. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. In that one experiment, it went 18 meters, but every gun is going to be different, every ammunition is going to be different.
And how far in a Glock 9, with the type of ammunition that was used that day, how far would it go?
I have no knowledge of that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And further.
Yes, just briefly, Your Honor. You say that the vest of the type worn by Officer Slager is a non-conductive material?
It should be, yes, sir.
And the tests you did were on a non-conductive vacuum?
It was on a Formica tabletop, relatively non-conductive.
Okay. So consistent? In that both surfaces are non-conductive?
The Formica is not going to be a very conductive surface. I wouldn't be able to say whether they're identical.
Okay. And I believe it suggested, I think, that sweat might make something, water would make electricity more conductive, correct?
That's beyond my scope.
Okay. And what about this? Would more conductive equal more damage, not less, correct?
Yes, in an instance where we used a metal plate in the experiment, it caused much more damage.
So a person who was heavily sweating, you would expect to see more of that damage that you saw on a conductive surface.
Again, the conductivity of sweat in the shirt is beyond my scope.
Okay. And briefly back to the GSR, if you had a video of a person getting shot within the 59 feet range several times, also video of the person who shot the firearm messing with the hands, also video of another officer coming up and touching the person, are those all perfectly scientific explanations of how a person might find GSR on their hands?
Yes, sir.
I have nothing further. Thank you, Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you. You may step down. You may call your next witness.
Your Honor, would this be a good place to take lunch? It's going to be rather long.
Let's call your next witness. Just got started.
Yes, sir. The defense was called on roll.
Stand and take a stretch. Yes. Everyone stand. All right.
You swear affirm the testimony shall give the court, the jury, and the trial in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your first and last name, and spell your last name loudly, clearly, in the mic.
Mark William Kroll, K-R-O-L-L.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. You prefer Dr. Kroll, Professor Kroll? How would you like to be addressed today?
I'm actually not picky at all, sir.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your background. What is your specialty?
I'm a biomedical scientist that specializes in bioelectricity and specifically the effects of electrical shocks.
Okay, and what is a biomedical scientist?
If you think of a triangle between engineering, medicine, and science, we live somewhat in between. Scientists answer questions about how the nature works, how the world works. They then give that information to engineers so they can design new products. And then the engineers give those products to people in medicine, to physicians to use to help patients. And we live right in between. We help all three branches of that triangle.
And did you receive formal education in that field?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the education you obtained.
I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics, a master's and PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Minnesota, and I have a master's in business administration from the University of St. Thomas.
And with that background, how did you get involved? It sounds like it's heavily electrical engineering.
That was my PhD, but I've spent my career in bioelectricity. I have not designed anything, so haven't really worked as an engineer.
And how did you get involved in bioelectricity?
I needed a student job, and at that time, the #1 pacemaker company was looking for a research assistant, so at age 18, I applied for a job at Medtronic, which is the Microsoft of medicine, the #1 pacemaker company in the world, and they hired me as a student.
And at what age were you?
I was 18.
And what was your status at that time? Were you a student?
Yes, sir.
And how long did you work for that company?
A little less than 2 years, and then I got a large scholarship and I was not allowed to have a job. So I went to school full-time until I graduated.
And what was your first job after you graduated that related to bioelectricity or biomechanical engineering?
My first job after education, which I have to stress is while I was finishing my PhD, so I actually started working a few years before I finished my PhD, but was on the reverse end of bioelectricity. We were taking electrical signals from the body. I was working for a startup that was improving on the electrocardiogram so we could give people early warning if they were going to have a heart attack. I went from there to a company making implantable defibrillators. We made a very small implantable defibrillator that would fit into the left chest so it did not have to go on the abdomen. At the same time, my brother and a friend and I started an external defibrillator company for a very simple operation. That's the one that you'll see in the walls at the Charleston Airport, the Cardiac Science. And then I went from there to St. Jude Medical, which is the #2 pacemaker company, and had various roles with them for 10 years and retired 11 years ago to spend more time teaching.
And where is it that you teach?
I teach biomedical engineering at the University of Minnesota as an adjunct full professor, and I'm also on the staff, adjunct staff, which means part-time, of the California Polytechnical University in San Luis Obispo. And I help with research, and I teach one class. Well, I give one lecture per year, forgive me.
Do you belong to any professional organizations, in addition to your academic teaching, that do electrical standards or setting standards for electrical boards and other standards for the electrical community as a whole?
Yes, the international safety standards for the whole world are set by an organization that's headquartered in Europe called the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, and they set safety standards so you would not be electrocuted by your television or this cord right here, or from a hairdryer or from an electric car. I sit on the top committee with 24 other experts from around the world, and we set the electrical safety standards for the whole world. And we have our next meeting in January, first week of January.
And where is that meeting?
Dresden, Germany.
And you, have you received any awards for your work in this career field?
Yes.
Could you tell us briefly about that?
I received a fellow award from the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and that's only given to the top 0.5% of their members. I am a fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering, and that's associated with the National Association of Science, National Academy of Science, forgive me. I received a fellow honor from the American College of Cardiology, which is almost never given to non-physicians, for my work on improving cardiac therapy. And I received a fellow honor from the Heart Rhythm Society, which is the specialty of physicians that focus on arrhythmias. And in 2010, I received the International Career Achievement Award in Biomedical Engineering.
Do you hold any patents for any work that you've done in this field?
Yes.
About how many do you have?
I have 370 some issued United States patents. I don't count the international ones because they're largely duplicates.
And what sort of equipment or ideas, or what have you patented that someone in the jury might recognize?
If you have ever known a friend or a family member that had a defibrillator in their chest, implantable defibrillator, they probably had one of my patents. That was the main area of my patenting, is improving on implantable defibrillators, also external defibrillators.
And have you ever written any books or edited any books related to this field?
Yes, I've edited co-edited 2 books on electrical therapy for the heart and another 2 books on electrical weapons.
And how does your background and experience relate to, let's say, the general field of CEWs, and explain to the jury what a CEW is?
I'm glad you brought that up because it's an area of confusion. When the first copy machines came out, they were manufactured by the Xerox company, and so everybody called it a Xerox machine. They said, make a Xerox, or they make it a verb, and they'd say Xerox this. And that's kind of where we're at with electrical weapons. Taser is the #1 brand. They're not the only brand. And eventually this will get sorted out. Because I publish books in this area and I publish articles, I have to use the official words because it's going down in print forever. So I'm used to calling it an electrical weapon. I'm used to referring to the action as electronic control. And every time the trigger is pulled, I wouldn't say tasing, I would say that's a trigger pull. And each time probes are launched, that's a probe deployment. So when someone says taser, I know what they mean. I have to think about whether they mean verb or noun or adjective. But I understand that, and so it's not going to be confusing. So if you hear me say electrical weapon, I'm not trying to be fancy, it's just habit.
And how long have you been associated with Taser International?
13 years.
And what is it that you do at the current time with them?
My primary role is sitting on their scientific and medical advisory board, along with experts in bioelectricity and cardiologists and other medical specialists, to help them direct their research. I also sit on their corporate board.
Do you sit on any other corporate boards?
I do. I sit on the board of Hemonetics, which is a large manufacturer of blood transfusion equipment headquartered in Boston. And that's a public company, and I sit on some private boards, for example, Prostacare, which is doing electrical therapy for cancer and prostate problems in Sydney, Australia, and some other smaller private companies.
Have you ever done any work in law enforcement related to Taser research or training?
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I've published a number of papers and done the backup research to answer a number of questions about the effects of Taser electrical weapons. For example, one of the concerns people has, could you get an infection because the probe is going in you? It's like a needle, right? And I published a paper earlier this year that answered that question. Other papers on what are the risks. For example, if you fall and hit your head, could you die from that? The answer is yes, it's happened many times. I'm working on a paper right now about the risk of getting a probe in the eye. Could that cause blindness? The answer is yes, and it's happened many times. So I've done a lot of research in various aspects of Taser electrical weapons.
Have you ever worked with the Department of Justice?
Yes, I've been an expert for them, both in criminal prosecutions and in defending in civil litigation.
And how about the U.S. Marshal Service?
Yes, and that was covered under the U.S. Department of Justice and the Border Patrol.
And any other law enforcement agencies around the United States?
Numerous, including Chicago Police Department on a regular basis and a number of cases with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department.
Have you ever been qualified as an expert in tasers or conducted electrical weapons in state or federal court?
Yes, in both, and that would include here in the United States, Australia, and Canada.
Your Honor, at this time, we offer Professor Kroll as an expert in the topic of conducted electrical weapons, specifically the taser.
Says the state.
Without objection.
He's admitted without objection.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, we're all wondering how you get from a pacemaker to a taser. So could you explain the underlying principles that make your experience in the biomedical engineering appropriate to work on tasers or conduct electric weapons. Tell us that connection.
But it's a little more of a stretch from pacemakers, because pacemakers only use 5 or 10 volts. But implantable defibrillators use up to 900 volt shocks. External defibrillators use shocks up to 3,000 and 4,000 volts. So it's all based on the same principles of how does a shock affect the human body.
And what specifically about the electrics of the human body is common between a defibrillator and a taser? What performance aspects of the electrical system of the body does it share in common?
One aspect for appropriate performance of an implantable defibrillator is that the wires are in the right place. And this is something I lecture on a lot. Next Monday night I'll be giving a lecture in Leeds, England, and next Tuesday night I'll be giving a lecture in London to British cardiologists about the proper way to put defibrillators in people. The wires are here versus here, where the wires should be to get the optimum performance. And similarly with taser electrical weapon, depending upon where the wires go, how far apart they are, you can get a dramatic difference in effects.
And the jury has heard this a few times, but could you explain the two different modes of, just briefly, the two different modes that a taser operates in and the different biomechanical processes behind the two of them?
There's probe mode and drive stun. In probe mode, which is used for distance control, or control at a distance, the probes go out attached to wires. They land in the body. If they are spread about a foot or more apart, then the pulses go between them, and you lock up enough muscle, the person will lose control and fall over. It doesn't matter if that person has drugs in their system, because you are directly controlling the what's called the motor nerve system, which is the nerves that control the muscle. The advantage is that this works even if people have drugs in them, and it works as a distance. The disadvantage is you have to have both wires in, and so it's a very tough shot. You went with a pistol, and you have to get one bullet in. Now you have to get two. And you have to have a good spread. If you're too close to the person and the probe's only this far apart, it can be very painful, but it's not going to lock up the determined person, especially if the person's got a little cocaine in them, because that's a powerful painkiller. And cocaine is a very special effect that it tends to block electrical signals, called sodium channel blocking. In drive stun, you use this when you're close in. There's no problem hitting the person because you're real close. You just connect with them. And the way it works is by giving a very unnatural stimulation. It's painful, but more important than the pain, it's very unnatural. Is this too much detail, the sensation?
Let me just ask one question here. Have you ever been drive stunned?
Yes, 2 times.
And who administered the drive stun to you?
I did in both times.
And was this intentional?
No.
Could you explain how it happened?
One case I was testifying, and one case I was lecturing.
And what were the circumstances? I want to make sure the jury understands when you talk about the unnatural feeling, why you're describing it as unnatural. So tell me about the time you were lecturing.
I was lecturing to the Vermont equivalent of SLED up in Vermont a few years ago, and I was taking the cartridge off, and I had pulled the trigger, and I'd let up on the trigger, and I was taking the cartridge off, and I forgot to wait the whole 5 seconds. So I got a nice shock to my hand.
And you said it's a different feeling. How is it different biomechanically, and why is it perceived differently, the drive stun?
Let's say you put your finger against a candle or a hot stove. There are heat sensors there, and they send a signal back via the nerve system in your brain, say that was hot. If I push down on this wooden ledge here, there's pressure there, and I get those signals back to my brain also says there's some pressure. If I put my finger in this cold water, there's sensors that say that's cold, and I get those signals back. Or I'll pick up vibration. And when we rub our finger on clothing, the fingerprints allow us to detect that texture as we go up and down. Those are all different signals. I can have pain with cold water, and it's very clear that it's pain from cold water or an ice cube. I can have pain from a candle, and it's very clear to me that it's a burn. And all those signals are sent back electrically to my brain. If I have a strong electrical shock down here, it lights up, if you will, all of those pain fibers. So all of those nociceptors, which are nerves that are specialized for detecting pain, are stimulated by the shock. And so signals back to my brain. And all that the brain gets is something's really wrong. And you really don't know what it is. It's a very bizarre feeling. If you've been shocked yourself, either because you touched an electric fence or you touched a car ignition coil or something like that, you know it's bizarre, it didn't last long, you pulled back, and you were able to identify it to electric because you saw it. If you can't see that, so you can't identify this as caused by electric shock, your brain is not able to override this strange, unnatural sensation until you get used to it and understand what's going on.
So, and that's different fundamentally from the probe mode, correct?
Yes.
And just for the record, you were drive stunned one other time, self-induced?
Yes, I was hired by the government of Australia when they were prosecuting some police officers for manslaughter, and I was testifying, and I was doing a demonstration of shocking a soda can and doing the arcs and all that, and ended up shocking my fingers. I missed the can and right in front of everybody. It was kind of embarrassing.
Were you able to hold on to the can and the taser, or did you lose control of the can and taser?
I screamed and I dropped everything.
So, have you ever experienced a taser probe stun in the probe mode?
I have.
And just describe briefly to the jury why you did that and what you found out from that.
I didn't want to be one of these scientists that writes papers and books and not know what it was really like. And so after several years of procrastination, I decided I was going to take a hit right in the chest. So I was supported under each shoulder because you can fall and get hurt. And then I was shot in the chest, one probe up here and one on the belly button. And I had a chance to experience it.
And how many times have you done that?
That was once, and that's definitely enough.
But it's your opinion that it is a different sensation than the drive stun?
I can't say that. It's a different mechanism because with the probe mode, you lock up muscle because there's enough distance between the probes that it gets down and hits the muscle. Electricity travels through the body a little bit like baseball. You can walk from first to second base and go straight, but people tend to bend out. And that's kind of what electricity does. It tends to go down and then come back up. And so it will stimulate all that muscle. So it's a different mechanism. They're still both painful. And in a sober person, I had no cocaine in me, no alcohol. They're both very painful and they're both very unnatural. The reason that I would say that the probe mode application was more intense is because there were wires in me and I couldn't just drop the thing. So it went on for a while.
And briefly, while I get this marked, could you explain to the jury, you said something about 5 seconds earlier, could you explain to the jury how the taser trigger system works and the sequencing of taser activation when you pull the trigger?
Well, you start out with the safety because the safety is on, which means the weapon is off. And the officer would flip that up with their thumb, and now the weapon is turned on. Then the laser pointer is on, and there's a flashlight underneath it. Then, when the officer feels it's time to apply the weapon, they pull the trigger. If there's a cartridge in there, the probes are launched to deliver the current. If there's no cartridge on there, then it's simply ready for drive-stun direct applications.
I'm going to show you what has been marked as Defense Exhibit 57. Would you flip through those very quickly and tell me if you recognize those?
I do.
And are those either provided by you or created by you to explain the operation of the taser to the jury?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I'd like to introduce defendants number 57.
Any objection?
Have no objection for demonstrative purposes, Your Honor.
So,
They're being offered into evidence. Is that
they're
right?
being offered into evidence, Your Honor, but at a minimum, we'd like to publish them, and I think we'll be able to clean up any problem of whether they should be used for demonstrative or substantive evidence after the witness has commented on.
Okay.
So let's take a look at defendant's number 57, first page there. And that is I think the jury's seen this before, we don't need to spend very much time on this. That is the cutaway of the taser, is that correct, or an explanation of the parts?
I'm not sure what the technical term for that drawing is. It's artistically stylized a little bit. This is literally what you would see if you had a high-speed camera, but I think this was constructed from those photographs.
Okay, so it's just a reflection of what a taser looks like, and what does the taser in that depiction have a cartridge?
Yes.
Do both photos there have a cartridge?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's take a look at the next photo there. You are depicting a drive stun in this,
Yes, sir.
and what is the purpose of the illustration on the right-hand side?
It's to show the path of the electrical current. I mentioned before how electrical current will dive into the body, and it depends on the length, like going from first to second base. And the previous slide, can you hear me if I stand up? The previous slide showed the probes going out, as I described in probe mode, and then you would get direct muscle control. And here we see what happens. These electrodes, I think Officer Fletcher refers to them as terminals on the muzzle of the weapon. They're right here. And the current goes in like this. It forms this kind of a canoe shape. So it goes through the epidermis, which is the leather of your skin, and then the dermis, which is the main layer, and some of the fat layer. And that's it. It does not get down to the muscles. But it hits all of these nerves, because our skin is just full of nerves to sense anything bad. So it concentrates all this current here to excite all the nerves to cause, frankly, a very painful and very unnatural sensation.
Probably more than we want to hear, but if you could give us an explanation on why the electricity travels like that. I think we have an illustration of the anode and the how the electrons travel, how the electricity travels between what would be the two ends of the taser here. And this is, once again, this is the State's Exhibit 49, which is a taser that has the battery removed. And
Thank you.
point out to the jury where the electricity travels and why it travels that way.
When the trigger's pulled, this top electrode delivers positive pulses, and the bottom electrode delivers negative pulses. If you had the weapon right up against the skin with a good contact, there's no arcing. But because the weapon is used on people that have clothing, it also generates up to a 50,000 volt arc to jump through clothing. So you can be back about 3.5 centimeters, about 1.5 inches roughly, and still get a connection. And that uses the phenomenon of electrical arcs. You've seen this in lightning, of course. The most common industrial application is arc welding, where you have a voltage and a metal is not in direct contact, and that temperature is so high that it melts the metal and makes it attach to the other piece of metal. And at the initial part of this arc, the voltage here is so high, the anode, that in the atoms that are near the cathode, the oxygen and nitrogen molecules, it actually takes electrons and pulls them away, because the negative electrons are attracted to this positive anode, which would be the top probe on the weapon, and they just pull them up, and they run up there and fan out, somewhat irregularly, because you can see how that works. And then after a while later in the pulse, maybe at 50 microseconds, then we start seeing some opposite flow with positive charged carriers going down here.
But it's not a straight line. Could you explain why it's erratic like that?
Well,
In
you
the
can
actual
see it here
arcs.
and in lightning, because you need carriers, you need charge carriers. There's no metal here in the air. And so if I strip all the electrons off of the oxygen and nitrogen that's here, now I gotta find a new path. So it's sort of like people making ruts in the woods or in the sand dunes with their Jeeps. You gotta find another path and wear that part down, so it jumps around a lot.
And you heard Ms. Fletcher talk about doing some experiments with dry stones in which the taser was held directly against the surface. You have the taser back there. So would you demonstrate to the jury, just put it straight down there, how she described, or how you imagine she described that, how the drive stun was accomplished?
Well, she did it two different ways. Here's the piece of clothing, and then she put the clothing just on a Formica tabletop, which would be non-conductive, and then applied the weapon there. And I'm not sure how much pressure she used. I don't know how much pressure she used. And that was one scenario. In the other scenario, she had a piece of metal there and also applied drive stun to the clothing or the cloth sample.
So you said that the taser is approximately 50,000 volts?
It can develop that in the arc, yes.
And what relation does the amount of voltage have to the distance an arc can travel?
Travels about 1 centimeter per 30,000 volts roughly, or 1 inch per 70,000 volts. But if you have sharp edges, it can travel further than that. So the 50,000 volts on that weapon is able to travel between these two electrodes, which are about 4 centimeters apart. So it can travel about 1.5 inches.
And is it possible to get an effect from a taser without both contacts touching the object that you're trying to tase? Will the arc still flow and cause any damage?
Yes, the arc is a very low resistance. The arc is as good as a piece of wire once it's formed for conducting electricity. That's why I can carry 1 million amperes in a lightning strike.
And as a matter of fact, arcing is a problem for some people in some industries, correct?
Yes.
What steps do people have to take to protect themselves against electrical arcs?
Well, a very common one for people that work in high voltages to wear special clothing that is resistant to arcs. So a lot of research has been done on the effect of electrical arcs burning clothing. As Ms. Fletcher pointed out, there hasn't been a specific paper on electrical weapons and clothing burns. But there's a lot of research on clothing that would be resistant to electrical arcs for the safety of high voltage electrical workers.
So the taser doesn't have to be in direct contact with an object that is being, and pardon the expression, tased, for there to be indication of damage of some sort. Is that correct?
It would not have to be in direct contact for the damage. In fact, if you had really good direct contact, you're generally not going to see that much damage. You do not develop any arc, except you can have some damage on the skin.
And let's talk for a moment. Have you had occasion to research what happens when skin is drive stunned?
Yes.
And did you publish anything in relation to that research that you did?
Yes, I published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, a forensic medical journal, with some pictures of this and descriptions, and then one of the 2 books that my colleagues and I did has a lot of pictures of these drive stun wounds as well.
Okay, and would you describe to the jury what we're seeing here?
On the left-hand side, you have 2 different drive stun wounds. Here, the weapon was applied skin once and then shifted over. Over here, we have the weapon being applied once here and then tipped over here.
And are those wounds typical wounds that you would see in the case of a drive stun?
Yes.
And can those wounds appear if a drive stun is done through clothing?
Yes.
How can the electricity travel through the clothing? Does it travel through the clothing?
It initially travels through the gaps in the fabric between the warp and the weave, if I'm using the right words. It initially punches through there. Given enough time, it will open a wider path because the arc is very hot, and you will get a full thread taken out like Ms. Fletcher found, depending upon the current and the time. And then you get a bigger hole.
You said the arc is very hot. How hot are those arcs?
An electric arc can be 35,000 volts, which is 4 times hotter than the surface of the sun.
So why, if it's 4 times hotter than the surface of a sun, doesn't a taser just spontaneously ignite the fabric?
It takes more than temperature. It takes a little bit of time to heat the thing up. You can have an extremely hot stove, and if you put a kettle on it full of water, it will still take 20 minutes to get that water to boil. So you have to overcome the mass, the weight of the fabric. If you have just a small sample, like think about dust, it can be explosive because it's so easily ignited. So if you had a very small sample of fabric, it could be instantly, or I shouldn't say instant because nothing's instant, but very quickly ignited. But when you've got a whole piece of cloth, there's more mass there, and the cloth is pulling heat away, to a certain extent, away from that hot spot, so it doesn't just immediately hit the high temperature.
And if one were to cycle the taser and there were bits of fabric on the ends there, on the terminals, as Ms. Fletcher calls them, if you could point that out to the jury, please. Due to the heat, is it your opinion that those fibers could be altered or destroyed if the taser were activated with small fibers on there?
Yes, they could be destroyed or modified.
And is that dependent on the type of fabric, or is the heat of the taser hot enough to render almost any substance on there to make it go away?
With enough time. I mean, as Ms. Fletcher very nicely pointed out, polyester is a little more sensitive. That's why the lower dial on your iron for polyester. Cotton, harder to burn. I'm no expert on fabrics, but there's a lot of 35,000 volts is very, I'm sorry, 50,000 volts, 35,000 degrees is very hot and would eventually burn up any fabric.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the polyester damage that we've seen here. Could you describe to the jury what you observe in that photo?
I took white and very dark polyester on the left-hand side, and in the middle you see the white polyester fabric, and on the right it is a very dark blue, high saturation, dark blue polyester. Now, I am not a fabric expert. My specialty is electric shocks. I would defer to Ms. Fletcher anything about the fabric, but I will confess to you, I went to Joann's fabric store in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I did buy these fabrics, and so I know they were polyester because they were attested to me that way by the sales lady. And then I put them over metal. So I wanted to make sure I got an arc through the fabric, and I did not want to get a surface arc. So
Okay, let me stop you right there. Could you explain the difference between a surface arc and an arc through metal?
there's a slide that shows that.
I'm showing you what's been marked as Appendix Exhibit 58. You recognize that?
I do.
And did you create that?
I did.
And will that help the jury understand the concept you're trying to explain?
I believe so.
Your Honor, the defense would offer defense number 58.
No objection for demonstrative purposes.
Submitted for demonstrative purposes.
So explain to the jury what you mean the difference between a surface and a penetrating arc.
Imagine that the muzzle is coming down here, and all we're doing is seeing the business end here. And we put that on a piece of fabric, and we have, say, Formica underneath here. The arc is going to go between these two electrodes on the muzzle. It's not going to go through the fabric. And so all we're going to see is surface damage. And Ms. Fletcher's work showed this very nicely. Now let's change the situation a little bit. And there's a lot of ways we can change it. For example, if we put this fabric on top of metal, the electrode is just as likely, or more, it's more likely to want to use this metal here, kind of like the freeway. So you might walk through the woods to get on the freeway, the big highway here, and then it goes on the highway, and then it comes back out here at an angle. And at the, depending on how thick this fabric is, at the bottom, these electrodes are going to be closer. And now, with enough time, we're going to get holes. I did an experiment with a bulletproof vest, and so I arced and went all the way through here, and I found the holes here were closer than the electrodes up here, because it tends to want to come down together. Like if you're walking to a path, you don't just walk straight out and then take a left. You might take a little kitty corner going through the park. That's kind of what the electricity does. And so we get a little closer spacing here. And there was some confusion before about why you would see holes sometimes and why you would just see surface burns. And this is basically what's going on. If you have the metal under here, and you start to see the surface, the holes, because it prefers to go through. If you are just like doing this, and you're on Formica, you're going to first see the surface burns. If you did it long enough, eventually the electricity thinks, maybe I'll try this route this time. And you could start seeing some holes, but that takes a lot longer. So if you just have a few seconds, you need the metal to get the holes. If you got more time, you're generally going to, and then get the holes.
So is it the fabric itself, or is it the air within the fabric that conducts the arc?
It's the air within the fabric.
So a very tight fabric would be less likely to conduct or more likely to conduct than a loose fabric, a loose weave. Tight weave versus loose weave.
It almost doesn't make a difference. It's not like water. When you think about something that's water repellent, if there's any way for air to go through there, the arc will find it, because the arc will follow that air. I mean, it will go through the Kevlar weave in a bulletproof vest. It finds a way through.
And it is dependent on whether what is underneath where the area being tased is conductive or not. Is that correct?
Yes, that assists. You can get a hole faster. And I wanted to clear something else up, because I think there was a little confusion before about whether the bulletproof vest was conductive or not. That really doesn't matter. What matters, because here you can imagine this being a bulletproof vest. No, it's not conductive. But when I have metal or conductive surface behind it, now the electrical arc will go through the air in the gaps of the Kevlar weave. And that air is conductive. So a bulletproof vest is not conductive itself, but the arc is conductive, just like whether it's lightning or arc welding.
And you looked at some of Ms. Fletcher's research that she did and the slides she created, correct?
I did.
And take a look at that. Explain to the jury your interpretation of those slides based on your knowledge of the taser arc.
Here we have surface damage for the surface arc, and here we have the microscopic hole, and that's actually came up with 466 micrometers. That'd be about right, and that'd be a little less than half of a millimeter, so it's pretty small. That's hole. pretty hard to see, but it's there.
And in your opinion, is Ms. Fletcher's analysis as to the fact that the damage on Mr. Slager's shirt is not inconsistent with the damage that might be caused by a taser, do you agree with that outcome, in your opinion?
I do, having worked with electricity my whole life, I could make a stronger opinion.
And what would your opinion be?
Well, there's really no alternative source for that heat damage. I mean, we both agree that it's not a clothes iron that's going to do that. And even some of the creative things that were thought up, like laying on the beach with the microscope, trying to burn a hole using the magnified sun, would give a different effect. An electrical arc effect is very distinctive. It burns in a certain way. It's very, very local. It's not like a flamethrower. It's not like a cigarette lighter. It's extremely local because the electricity just says, just get out of my way. I just need to get through here between this fiber and here. And right there, it's up to 35,000 volts. So it makes a very distinctive hole and marking, as Ms. Fletcher correctly pointed out. So I think we can exclude any other cause. There's nothing that I can think of, and I've been in this business a long time, that could have caused that damage besides the taser electrical weapon being used against Officer Slager's shirt.
And how do you explain the fact that Ms. Fletcher's demonstration generated holes for the most part, and there are no holes that she detected in Officer Slager's shirt?
To get the holes in a 5-second application, you generally need a metal background. And to get the holes without the metal background, I think she needed 10 or 15 seconds on average, and it varies. So there's some variability there, but it's really not anything that would make me change my opinion.
So if there was a tase attempted in a dynamic situation where the taser was moving, the person being tased was moving, there's not going to be a constant application of the taser flat against the surface. Does that make a difference in your observation?
Yes, thank you for bringing it up. To get these holes, nothing can be moving. We would need to be right on that spot because the source of this 35,000 degrees is very small, and there's a tiny arc, and if you move that around, you're not going to get holes.
Porchy Johnson. Just a little bit about, once again, the taser trigger operation itself. If you pull the take the safety off and pull the taser trigger, how long is it supposed to operate?
5 seconds.
If you pull the taser trigger and continue to pull the taser trigger, how long will it operate?
It'll go for several minutes until the battery runs out.
So there's no limit to how long it will run, as long as the taser trigger is pulled, limited only by the battery?
That's correct.
How does the taser recorder record those? For example, if you hold the taser trigger for 10 seconds, what will it record?
It will record the time that the current delivery stopped round it up to the next second. If it's, say, if it's 9¼ seconds, it'll show it as 10. And that's the duration, and it will show the time of date when it ended.
So if you had, let's say if someone held the taser trigger for 10 seconds, would it record in the data recorder as a 10-second application, or would it record as a 5-second followed by a 5-second application?
It would be recorded as a 10-second application in the X26. In the older M26, it would click off every 5 seconds. That causes some confusion, but that weapon was not involved in this case.
Okay, so there was a previous one that just counted in increments of 5?
Yes, sir, and it would just stamp 5, 5, 5, 5. But that weapon's no longer manufactured.
But this one will do it in increments of a minimum of 5?
There's a difference between the recording and the current delivery. And the reason this occurred is that officers are trained to, with a firearm, to keep pulling the trigger until the threat is down or stopped. And so then they would apply that training to an electrical weapon, and they would pull the trigger, and if the probes went in, the guy would go down, and then they'd think, okay, he's all done, now I can go in and handcuff him, and then they'd take their finger off the trigger, and immediately the fight's back on. So the company programmed in a minimum 5-second application time to prevent that problem. So when you pull the trigger, the duration of this current delivery is 5 seconds. The recording is just one line that says, here's the time of day, how many seconds the duration was, how much is left in the battery, and what the temperature is.
And would you, despite your previous experiences with the taser, would you be willing to install the battery in this taser and see if it operates in the drive stun mode?
I would.
Your Honor, this taser has been, would you guys, this taser's been tested before, but I think it would benefit the jury to see and hear it, although I do not think that the battery is sufficiently charged just from previous experimentation with it. Any objection to attempt that? Okay, well, we'll go ahead and try it. We'll give it the old try. I think the relevance of it, Your Honor, would be the
There's no objection, and I need to hear an argument.
okay.
I did object on relevance, but
And Your Honor,
No,
I
I
think,
didn't ask for any argument. You may proceed.
thank you. And let me give you the battery.
Thank you. Okay, appears to be ready.
Just for their comfort, don't aim it anywhere there, aim it somewhere towards the wall, although we know it's not going to do anything, and you could attempt to take the safety off and see if it will do anything.
Oh, it's dead.
Okay.
Well, there was enough there for the light to come on, but not enough to discharge.
And what was that pop?
It was able to get one crackle out, one pulse out.
So how many pulses, do you know how many pulses a second the taser operates at?
This one operates at 18.3.
So that one pop, there would have been 18.3 of those pops per second if it were operating properly?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Judge, would reoffer defendants' exhibits 58 and 57, although I'm going to strip out some of 57 and present, see if there's objection to this.
objection?
Yeah, we had no problem with Joe to the jury verdict, the prosecuting clerk says we object to it.
It'll be marked for identification. I can address that issue later.
Okay, thank
Published
you, Your
them
Honor. And the-
already, so
And the
that's-
same with 58,
All right.
if you would. Thank you, Judge. And Professor Kroll, please answer any questions that the state may have.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll break now for lunch. Let's see, it's 1:35. It'll take an hour and 15 minutes. What's that? 1:45. We'll break hour and 15 minutes for lunch. Please do not discuss the case. I think that'll be about 2:40. I need to take a look at the exhibits that there's an objection to. It's impossible for the court to rule on objections without seeing what I'm ruling on. And we'll break. Please do not discuss your testimony with anyone during the break.